Welcome everybody to this event, part of the ongoing work of our Race, Ethnicity and Education SIG around this very important issue. Hopefully the discussion today will lead to some further thoughts, conversations and actions. The SIG has done some great work already on this, and they continue today to add richly to the academic conversations, seeking to influence policy discourses and professional practice through evidence-based research. This topic was covered in a special issue of our members magazine, Research Intelligence, at the start of the year. BERA members on this event will be able to access that via our website. And actually the two presenters today have covered the issue and further reflections on it as the year has gone by in the latest issue of Research Intelligence. And that article has been made free to access for anybody, and we can send the link round that will be on our Twitter account as well. So I'm delighted that we'll be able to have this conversation today, talking about decolonizing as opposed to just diversifying the curriculum. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker today to lead the discussion, Dr. Marlon Moncrief. Marlon is a convener of the Race, Ethnicity and Education SIG. He is also a member of BERA's council, and in the day job, as it were, offers expertise in teaching and learning through theories of critical multicultural education. Having been a teacher in primary schools for almost 15 years, where he was head of mathematics, head of English, and a deputy head, leading on curriculum monitoring and assessment. And his continuing research on curriculum development concentrates on initial teacher training and primary school education through the use of narrative inquiry as a method for teaching and learning on race equality. And he focuses particularly on 20th century Black British history and its cross-cultural interaction with white Britain for helping advance education, teaching and learning about fundamental British values, and for decolonizing the curriculum. And it's wonderful to have Marlon here leading this discussion today. And I now will hand over to him to take forward the debate this afternoon. So over to you, Marlon.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for attending, everybody. I'm Dr. Marlon Moncrief of the School of Education at the University of Brighton. I'm the co-convener of the BERA Race, Ethnicity and Education Special Interest Group. I'm joined today by my colleague and friend, Professor Richard Harris of the Institute of Education, University of Reading. Rich is the BERA member and active with the BERA History Special Interest Group. Welcome. We want to share context of this webinar. We want to share some related research that we've undertaken, some of the theories that are part of that research as well, as we seek to advance thinking around this educational theme of decolonizing the curriculum. And we want to have an impact on educational policy and teaching practices in the now and in the future to advance opportunities for all in education. So let me give you an example of the webinar structure. Next slide. Let's see. So if we go to the next slide, then I'll talk about the webinar structure. So this is a brand new process for me. I've lots of screens in front of me here. I've got Dwara and Marie, my BERA colleagues in the background, supporting with the screen changes and IT expertise. So I'm very lucky there. But I'm going to talk about the webinar content text, first of all, as part of this presentation, and then share some examples of evidence-based research from a primary school perspective with trainee teachers on decolonizing the curriculum and the theories that were involved in that particular research process and what we learned from that. And then I'm going to bring in Richard Harris to sort of discuss what we understood from that particular research process, working with trainee teachers on decolonizing the curriculum, and to consider notions of historical consciousness as well for supporting teaching practices in the future. This webinar is going to be very much an interactive process. We want you to take part in the polls that we have constructed for this, and the brainstorming and the Q&A. So there's plenty of space for your interaction. And we'll obviously finish with some action summary points and some ideas as to how we can move this discussion forwards. So let's begin. Next slide. So, context. Earlier this year, I'm going to be reading some of these slides as well, so we can ensure that the points are taken down and are clear. So earlier this year, the brutal suffocation and subsequent death of the African-American George Floyd caused by a white American policeman in Minneapolis, Minnesota, USA, shocked and angered people across the world. This incident empowered the force of worldwide Black Lives Matter protests. In the UK, these protests have also thrown a critical focus on how the narrative of British history is represented publicly. There are concerns over an historical narrative that portrays Black history largely in terms of slavery and colonization, have seen Black and white protesters tearing down statues of those that are seen to have benefited from the exploitation and oppression of Black people. Such symbols are a visible and painful reminder of past trauma in the current day. Statues of Edward Colston and Robert Milligan, both slave traders, have been removed, whilst Oriel College in Oxford has agreed to remove the statue of the imperialist Cecil Rhodes. Protesters have also called for a decolonisation of the dominant Eurocentric curriculum in education to give space for teaching and learning of Black history as part of a fuller and more representative teaching of the past. Next slide. So what we want to argue is that history is not a static collection of facts. And we need to think about these calls more carefully, especially in relation to education. Statues are not history. They're part of a process of memorialization. At some point in time, there were influential people who decided that certain people deserve to be remembered in this particular form, in the form of statues. That does not mean that those statues have to be there forever. There are numerous examples around the world, which we can talk about later, where statues have been removed, replaced or destroyed as governments change, as ideologies change. Such developments are part of a changing fabric of society. And if anything, statues are a reflection of what a society or a certain section, usually the elite, usually the influential of the majority, values at a particular moment in time. It means that those particular symbols can be imposed as well. So the concern about history being rewritten, we argue misses the point. We're arguing that the doing of history means that it needs to be rewritten. What we do means it needs to be rewritten. And history is not a static collection of facts, but a process of discovery, reflection, and reinterpretation by each generation. And when it comes to talking about historical consciousness later on, we can come back to this point we are trying to make about history not being a static collection of facts. And we're going to talk about how that relates to the national curriculum today. Next slide. So it brings us to the question of history in schools and demands to change the national curriculum. Deciding what goes into a history curriculum is a massive responsibility, and at present in England, there's little mandated content that has to be taught. The 2013 proposals for history did provide a very detailed list of people at the beginning and events that needed to be taught, but this got the short shrift from the history education community. So Michael Gove did not get his way fully, and it was replaced with a more relaxed approach to naming specific content. So there is opportunity in that curriculum to make it broader, make it more balanced, but we just need to be able to encourage teachers and educators to see within that. This is what we're going to try to do with this particular presentation today. Next slide. So the next slide is on the repositioning of the history curriculum. there's a requirement that the curriculum enables young people to gain a coherent knowledge and understanding of Britain's past and that of the wider world. Okay, and the outline of the topics in the history curriculum do have a strong Anglo-centric focus. We've seen that. That's been recognised by lots of people now. But there's no reason why that should not include the more representative teaching of people's experiences. There's ways and means in which we can allow for a curriculum that is repositioned to demonstrate the inclusion of broader people's experiences through the teaching and learning of mass migration. We're going to argue in this. Movement of peoples has been a constant feature of the history of the British Isles. The population of these islands since Yedok really has always been diverse. And this presentation, this discussion today is aiming to raise the profile of that particular aspect of British history and its teaching in schools. So by including Black history within the curriculum, it's not about rewriting history at all. It's recognizing that there has been a conspicuous absence of certain forms of historical experience taught in the curriculum. So what we're talking about is a repositioning of the history curriculum, but that repositioning also needs the recalibration of teachers' positions in how they approach the curriculum as well. So this is what we're going to be discussing. So next slide, please. So let's get interactive. Giving you some context as to why we've brought this webinar together, and just want to open this up to the audience. What do you think may be the best approach to any repositioning of the history curriculum? 3 choices. The notion of diversification, I haven't given you a definition just yet, decolonisation, or something else, other. Can you consider what you think might be the best approach to any repositioning of the history curriculum to make it more inclusive? So have a vote now and we'll see what we come up with. Let's take a moment to do that. Let's see what we come up with. Seems to be, give it another 20 seconds or so. It's shifting around a little bit. We'll talk through all 3 responses. And we'll get people's responses and their own interpretations of these terms as well. It's important to understand this. Okay, we're going to close the poll in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's close that poll now, Dior, and we'll take a screenshot of that. And as we go on now, it will be, here's an opportunity for people who clicked other to sort of explain what you mean by the other, and also those of you who've clicked decolonisation, you can maybe give your interpretation of that, and the same for diversification. But here's what we here's our discussion of the differences between diversification and decolonising. We see that any repositioning of curriculum takes us to a consideration of the differences between those. And to simply diversify the content of curriculum is not the same as decolonising the curriculum, because diversifying is simply adding different content, whilst decolonising goes deeper than that. It requires an awareness of power, of white privilege, and how the curriculum aims and contents serve white privilege and white power and Anglocentrism, and omits experiences and lives of other people. So it's an appreciation that mindsets have created institutional structures, discourses, resources, such as the curriculum that favour the white majority. And because this privilege has been internalized over the years, it's difficult to recognise. It becomes the norm, it becomes taken for granted. And so in order to allow for more inclusive curriculum that's going to enable broader knowledge bases to be shared, a curriculum that's a dominant white curriculum needs to be deconstructed. And that needs to be realised. This is what we think. We see that a decolonised history curriculum would guide teachers and learners to a curriculum that is more representative of a range of past experiences. Priggs has written about that. And a decolonised history curriculum would therefore not only look at Black history in terms of topics such as Septimus Severus, which is not part of the curriculum. We learn about Caesar. We don't learn about these Roman leaders, these Black Roman leaders, Quintus Lollius Urbicus. We don't learn about that particular Black leader. We learn about other European Roman leaders, Mansa Musa, and the Windrush generation. These could be incorporated into the curriculum to give alternative narratives to the histories that are there already, particularly to do with the Romans, to do with mass migration, and many other themes as well. But also how mindsets have come to be that aim to project those particular narratives, and how people from different backgrounds experience events and view them from different perspectives. What we're arguing is that, the broader the perspective we offer, the fuller the education. Such approaches can help to disrupt the dominant privileged white discourse, the Anglo-centric discourse, and provide a fuller, richer historical understanding of the past. This is what we see. I'm just going to bring up my Q&A from here. So, next slide, please. So let's consider some evidence-based research that myself and Richard were involved in relation to decolonising the Key Stage 2 history curriculum. Okay. As I've said earlier, the history curriculum for Key Stage 2 says that pupils, this is one of the statutory requirements, pupils should continue to develop a chronologically secure knowledge and understanding of British, local and world history, establishing clear narratives within and across the periods they study. And they should note connections, contrasts and trends over time. So it suggests that there's an opportunity to expand upon what may first look at as a Eurocentric, Anglo-centric approach to teaching about history and particularly mass migration. What we need to remind ourselves is that the Key Stage 2 history curriculum, it does stop at 1066, and effectively, it's only when you get to Key Stage 2 can you have the opportunity to develop a chronological awareness of migration. But what we know is that that's not a statutory obligation. So it's about being able to encourage teachers to expand upon this particular recommendation. Next slide. So let's look at this. Teaching and learning about mass migration and settlement on the British Isles via the national curriculum. So my research examined Key Stage 2 history curriculum specifications for teaching and learning about mass migration to the British Isles over the ages. The word migration, key word, strong word, it doesn't appear in the programs of study for primary school history. And episodes of European mass migration by Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Scots and Vikings, they're variously described as being invasions and struggles between those particular groups, different ethnic groups, if you want. Okay, but those invasions, were, they were part of. Arguably, they were migrations as well. But I define those as cross-cultural encounters. Cross-cultural encounters between different tribes and different ethnic groups. The Saxons and Vikings were different tribes and different ethnic groups. And I wanted to see whether there was any historical congruency between what happened in the 8th century to what may have happened more recently, or in other aspects of British history when people in groups migrate to the migrate to the British Isles. So, as I've said, the Key Stage 2 curriculum stops at 1066, and it provides no further explicit opportunity for teaching and learning about mass migration to the British Isles. And I wanted to understand how primary school teachers were, especially trainee teachers. I wanted to understand whether their deep-rooted attitudes influenced the way in which they taught about mass migration to the British Isles in the classroom. Next slide. So, this study was about examining the background influences of white British primary school trainee teachers and their thinking about British history. I wanted to find out how teachers were conditioned by their backgrounds and their education. I wanted to know about the schools that they went to. I wanted to know about the neighborhoods that they grew up in, the history that they were taught. It was specific to examining the attitudes of white British teachers because white British teachers, from the recent census of the workforce, they make up 88% of the teaching workforce in primary and secondary schools. There's been a plethora of research conducted on this particular approach to understanding attitudes at a secondary school level. The work of Richard Harris, Isma Crum, and Dean Smart. We've got a reference list later on. They've done a lot of work on this in looking at secondary school teachers' attitudes, but there's been little conducted on primary school teachers' attitudes. They have a big responsibility to introduce teachers, children to history. So I work with 27 white British primary school teachers, all of them focusing on history as a specialism. So that meant that their large piece of evidence-based research on their school training meant that they had to sort of write an essay and do some research on history teaching in the primary school. 90% of my sample around that were from dominant monocultural white British socialization and influence. They took part in a survey, and I conducted follow-up interviews and focus groups. And one key question that I wanted to understand from them in their approaches to working with the curriculum and teaching and learning about history was, what does British history mean to you as a trainee teacher? What does it mean to you? What do you think of straight away when you think about British history? And how might that influence the way in which you teach about that in the classroom? So before I share my findings on that, next slide. And we're going to come back to your responses in my discussion with Richard. Let's do another poll. Which one of these challenges do you think is most significant for white British teachers in their approaches to decolonising the history curriculum? Okay. So if you want to consider those particular responses, we can come back to analysing and discussing these further. So is it the reflexive ability to dismantle their constructed selves? The experiences of students who come from different backgrounds, is that a challenge for white British teachers? Subject knowledge, how to teach topics, past events, or just confidence? What do you think is the most significant challenge for white British teachers in decolonising the history curriculum? Okay, there's 10 more seconds on this. It's shifting around a little bit. I can see that. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we'll close that poll now, Dior. Thank you, and we'll come back to these responses and questions in our discussion after this presentation. We're not just going to leave those. Thank you. So next slide then. So let me give you some just a brief snapshot of what I found up from my survey, interviews and focus groups. So that particular key question, what does British history mean to you? The majority of white British primary school trainee teachers of monocultural socialisation, so they went to dominant white primary schools, dominant white secondary schools, were from dominant white neighbourhoods. They reproduce the same exclusive traditional ideas of British history found in the national curriculum that focused on the Romans, the Vikings, the Saxons, the Tudors, Empire, and the Victorians. That was what British history meant to that particular group of trainee teachers, whilst the small majority of white British teachers who were socialised in multicultural British primary schools, secondary schools, neighbourhoods, they spoke more about seeing British history from an ethnically diverse and fluid perspective of different peoples. It's 27 teachers. I'm not going to aim to generalise outside of that, but that was an interesting pattern, that the majority of that group were simply reifying what the dominant discourses of the national curriculum are now and were in the past, and potentially could be reproducing those in their future teaching and learning. Next slide. So, I was interested in using examples of cross-cultural encounters from the distant past to do with migration and interaction between different ethnic groups, and juxtaposing them with experiences and stories from recent British history. And being a Black British man with Afro-Caribbean parentage, and having experienced myself as a child, the 1981 uprisings or cross-cultural encounters between white Britain and the Afro-Caribbean people, I thought that there may be something in that particular episode in relation to what has gone on before, when different ethnic groups come together on an island and aim to understand each other, aim to understand where each other are coming from. So I thought by juxtaposing the dominant narrative with more marginalized episodes of mass migration and settlement over the ages could be an interesting way in which to ask trainee teachers about teaching and learning about mass migration, cross-cultural encounters for decolonising the curriculum. Because from my perspective, the past can be connected to the present for understanding future possibilities in teaching and learning and development in knowledge and understanding about British people. So what could be learned from this to advance approaches to teaching and learning? Next slide. So, in considering mass migration and settlement, a significant moment discussed in the research were these cross-cultural encounters, and it was that word, the struggle, that stepped out for me. When you look at the national curriculum, it talks about the Anglo-Saxon struggle. I saw that that notion of struggle between different ethnic groups over the ages was perhaps a feature that was repeated over time. So what could we learn about these cross-cultural struggles? And so, as I said, I was looking at that in particular with these particular uprisings of the 20th century. They're commonly known as riots, but that's disputable. Again, that could be brought into the classroom at secondary school level or at primary school level. Some people call them riots, struggles, uprisings, disturbances. If you're speaking about cross-cultural encounters in Northern Ireland, you call them troubles. So the language of cross-cultural encounters is something that needs to be decolonised as well, I feel. I ran focus groups with primary school trainee teachers of the monocultural white British socialisation, and I presented them with oral testimonies and experiences of the cross-cultural encounters of the 1981 uprisings, riots. So those oral testimonies came from people who had witnessed firsthand those particular struggles, people of the Windrush generation. And I wanted to test whether there was a potential in using those narratives with the trainee teachers to bring the Black British historical experience to the fore, to the centre of the Key Stage 2 National History curriculum with a view of decolonising. I found that that the trainee teachers that I was working with, that they were amazed by the possibilities that could be developed in curriculum teaching and learning once they began to think outside of those Eurocentric, those Anglo-centric norms of Anglo-Saxon struggles only in defining the way in which British people have come to learn about each other, if you want. Okay, next slide. So here are some of the focus group responses. One female trainee said, "You've got the chance to contrast Anglo-Saxon laws and justice, and invasions, death and resistance. And all of those sorts of words may be associated with rights and change. There's nothing post-1066 about explicit migration. Unless you take it on yourself as a teacher, you're not going to get that." Another trainee teacher said, "There are some good comparisons to be made. If immigrants from Jamaica moved to Britain to increase their chances of wealth and to make money, then what did the Saxons move to the British Isles for? Compare it. Is there any change or movement over time? The Saxons, they moved for resources, which is kind of like money. So you can make comparisons through questions like, has it changed that much? Children can think about that. What similarities are still there? What are the differences between these moments in history over time?" So those were some interesting responses from three trainee teachers of history who were of the group who came from dominant monocultural backgrounds, dominant backgrounds of in terms of where their socialization were dominant white primary schools and secondary schools. They were using these narratives of Black British history and changing their perspectives and shifting their perspectives in terms of what they could do with the national curriculum that had been placed in front of them. Next slide. So this is an important thinking point for us as part of this discussion. Teachers as critical curriculum thinkers. It's important that primary school teachers are empowered to engage in the questions and debate the what and the why of curriculum implementation in their teaching and learning, not just to simply be curriculum makers and uncritical about what they're doing. We need to encourage trainee teachers to become critical curriculum thinkers, to see particular statutory aims and contents and be able to advance those with the children in their classroom according to their particular context as well. So this means actively evaluating the educational worth of the given curriculum aims and contents, because it's a construct. So they need to be able to see that they're not chained to those particular aims and contents, that they've got the opportunity to advance those. So what we're saying is that curriculum change is one thing, the call for curriculum change is one thing, that can be done, but allowing teachers to think more broadly, or giving them the autonomy, or explaining to them that they have the autonomy to think more broadly, so that they can teach outside of the box, has to go hand in hand with that notion of curriculum change. Next slide. So here are some further responses from the trainee teachers after being given the oral testimonies and the narratives of Black British history, of their experiences of mass migration, cross-cultural encounters with white Britain and settlement. One teacher said, I think that if we're going to be talking about tolerance, and if we're going to be talking about mutual respect, if we're going to be teaching those British values, then we are going to need to have multicultural perspectives within the curriculum. Okay, and I found it to be quite a significant response from this particular teacher, Diana, it's a pseudonym, who came from a white British monocultural background. She was seeing that that there was more to be done with the curriculum, that the curriculum needed to be deconstructed, that whiteness, that Anglocentrism needed to be dismantled in order to allow for new epistemologies, new knowledge bases to come to the fore. And personally, after doing this particular study, I saw that the use of Black British histories, more marginalized histories, cross-cultural encounters, gives great possibilities for taking the power out of I guess the original construction of this notion of fundamental British values, because using more marginalized histories from minority ethnic groups, Black history, Irish history, Indian history, in relation to British history, minority ethnic group British history, allows us to cast a critical lens upon the nation's multicultural history and how we have come to learn and relearn the meaning of tolerance and mutual respect of those with different faiths and beliefs, as the DfE's guidance asks us to do. So arguably, with the, in the cross-cultural encounters between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, after those tensions and those violent fights between those particular groups, they had to work it out between each other. They had to think about things such as tolerance and mutual respect. And the same can be said of cross-cultural encounters involving uprisings and riots between white Britain and Black Britain in the 20th century. Tolerance, mutual respect had to be considered after those. It's just that the story doesn't have to center on the Anglo-centric story. We can look to Black British history, we can look to other aspects of history to center the narrative around those fundamental British values. Next slide. So, we must engage in teaching and learning about the history of people's migration to the British Isles over the ages, and their various cross-cultural encounters offer great possibilities in making better use of those statutory educational policies of fundamental British values, which is, lots of debate around that, of course, okay? This will allow teachers to cast a critical lens upon the nation's multicultural history and on how we have come to learn and need to continue to relearn the meaning of tolerance and mutual respect with those of different faiths and beliefs in following the DfE's statutory requirements. Teachers should take ownership of this policy, think differently and more creatively. what we need to remember, about some of the things I've been showing in this presentation is that teaching and learning about invasions and struggles between Saxons and Vikings in Key Stage 2, I used to teach it as well as a former primary school teacher in Year 4. It cannot avoid speaking about violence, and in fact, the violence of the 8th century is probably more bloody than the violence of the cross-cultural encounters that I've referred to that relates to Black British history completely. But these are cross-cultural encounters, and those cross-cultural encounters enable us to learn about the fundamental British values. It just doesn't have to be centered around the Anglo-centric story. Okay, so these stories can be applied to more recent cross-cultural encounters to see the historical relevance. And this enables us to decolonize the curriculum if we look to those marginalized stories. More importantly, these tensions were addressed between different peoples and in terms of how they came to coexist with each other through those values of tolerance, mutual respect, democracy, rule of law, and individual liberty. So that was a bit of the research. Before we talk a bit, before we spend a short time on looking at some of the theories of that particular research, which will help with notions of decolonizing the curriculum. Next slide. I just want us to think for a couple of minutes individually about any example of a cross-cultural encounter, a story that could be applied as an authoritative lead in the narrative teaching and learning about tolerance and mutual respect. Any particular story of a cross-cultural encounter that could be used, that could be centered from a minority ethnic perspective, just pop them up on display and we can consider some of those. One that comes to mind for me straight away is Stephen Lawrence, of course. So, Notting Hill Carnival is, of course, that came about because of the cross-cultural encounters between African and Caribbean people, the migrants at that particular time, and the settled white British people who were migrants themselves, obviously. But those cross-cultural encounters, what came out of that was the need to show some tolerance and some respect. So yeah, I mean, fundamental British values. I did a piece of research on how that is shown in primary schools, and when we looked at the display boards around those particular primary schools, we didn't really see many images of the Notting Hill Carnival speaking to notions of mutual respect and tolerance. Hopefully in the future, we may see that being used to teach about the fundamental British values rather than the norms that we've seen in terms of the images of Anglocentrism and so on. Some really good responses there. Continue to sort of talk about your responses in the Q&A box, and we'll aim to come back to those. We'll take a screenshot of this as well in my discussion with Richard to see how we can extend upon these. So let's move on to the next slide. Let's look at some of the theories that I've applied to that particular study on decolonizing the curriculum. So I'm saying that the researcher's position, next slide. I'm saying that the research is positioned conceptually with Banks's concept of transformative critical multicultural education. Let me explain what I mean by that. A transformative approach changes the basic assumptions of the existing Anglo-centric curriculum and aims to help students who are being taught, trainee teachers, if you will, as well, current teachers, to understand concepts and issues from different ethnic and cultural perspectives, to become aware that knowledge is not culture free, of course, but rather constructed through perspectives of those who have the power. Okay, so it's about being able to dismantle that through this particular theory. In the transformative approach, students, trainee teachers, if you want, even current teachers coming to know about this particular way of thinking, learn that the dominant narratives, but you know, they learn about those, of course, but they also aim to reposition those with alternative narratives. And in the end, it's hoped that students, trainee teachers, current teachers will be able to think critically about whose narratives are used and the consequences of this. So critical, transformative, multicultural education, which I see the research that I've just discussed, allows for changing the basic assumptions of the existing curriculum, aims to, you know, allows for decolonizing the curriculum, allows for dismantling dominant power bases and viewpoints such as whiteness and Anglocentrism, and it allows opportunities for greater forms of inclusion. So that's one theory that needs to be considered. Another theory that I applied as part of this study in understanding orientations, next slide, in understanding orientations is a notion of historical consciousness. And I looked to Jean Roussen's typologies, and he speaks on this, about this in terms of how we orientate ourselves, exist and function in the now through our knowing the past as a guide for future perspectives. I think this is a really important way of understanding debates and differences on how we use history to understand the now and the future. And let me show you the next slide so you can see those particular typologies. Next slide. So Rousseau speaks of these particular four typologies: the traditional, the exemplary, the critical, and the genetic. And some of you, as part of this audience, you will probably know about these particular typologies. I don't want to preach to the converted, but for those of you who don't, have a read and have a think. Consider this: how is the current curriculum positioned in its orientations with the nature and purpose of history? How are the current aims and contents positioned? Why? Why are they positioned in that particular way? Okay. And how do arguments for decolonial theory and decolonizing the curriculum fit with these typologies? Different ways of seeing. Arguably, what the research that I showed you with those teachers' responses after seeing what they could do with the examples of Black British history, I would argue that I shifted their thinking from the traditional type of seeing history to a more critical and genetic type of seeing possibilities with history. So rather than looking at the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings as the only way of teaching about fundamental British values such as tolerance and mutual respect, they're able to critique that and to disrupt the national curriculum through a more critical perspective, and orientate with newer ways of seeing about tolerance and respect, and through the narratives of Black British history, seeing that changes of the essence, seeing that history is fluid, is happening today, and that relates to the point that we made earlier, that history isn't static. So I would argue that those teachers shift from the traditional to the critical, to the genetic in their praxis, at least. Okay. So yeah, just have a read and think about that. This is a slide that we'll come back to when I bring Richard in a moment. Next slide, please. It's a bit of a plug. My book is now available to purchase. It speaks about the research that I've spoken about today. It encompasses the theories. It gives evidence-based research on those teachers those training teachers that I worked with. It gives the narratives that I used, those narratives of Black British history that I used in full. It gives those, and it shows how training teachers were able to reposition the way in which they view the national curriculum, and to become critical curriculum thinkers. So this book calls for a reconceptualization and decolonization of the Key Stage 2 national history curriculum. And I present on how teaching and learning Black British history in schools can be achieved, and how I center my own Black British identity and my own minority ethnic group experience to support a framework of critical thinking around curriculum decolonization. So that's available to use. I'm going to just, next slide, please. I'm going to leave you with some references. I think these, I understand that these slides from this presentation are going to be made available on the Bureau website, as well as further readings that Nick spoke about earlier on in this webinar. We're gonna now sort of bring in Richard Harris to consider some of the talking points that have come up from the Q&A, that have come up from the polls that we've generated, and also from the context that we're considering around decolonizing the curriculum. Hello, Richard.
Hello there, Marlon.
Thanks for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you. You were heavily involved in this research, and it was a fantastic process for me to work with you and the teachers. And we did this research quite a while ago. I wouldn't have thought that we'd be in this particular situation today, where we've had the Black Lives Matters protests and the calls for curriculum change through Black British history, and demands for change, because the dominant Anglo-centric curriculum has been sort of almost like identified. The call isn't anything new, but some people would say, well, if you're calling for Black British history, why not Irish history? Why not Indian history? You know, is it a pretentious call, or what's your view on this call? Did you have?
I mean, it's always a tricky question. I mean, you're right that there's been through time there's been lots of discussions about the nature of the curriculum and the fact that it is very white, it's very Anglo-centric. I remember, you know, long time ago, former HMI John Slater talked about the curriculum being very Southern Anglo-centric as well. So there's lots of excluded groups from that sort of master narrative. I think the call for Black British history is important, but as you've rightly pointed out, that then raises the questions, well, what about other histories? And I think it's important to recognise the fact that history is about people's experiences, and I would argue that we need to be looking at much more from the perspective of people's lived experiences, which would incorporate a much broader range of people. I think one of the things that I've often felt is that the history we teach in this country in particular tends to be a very top-down political sort of history, and we don't actually have very much of a sort of like a bottom-up people's approach. I remember reading some work by Ken Osborne in Canada, and he made an interesting distinction between the history of Canada and the history of Canadian peoples. And though subtle, that's actually quite an important distinction. I think you can make the same case here, that we tend to teach the history of Britain rather than the history of the British peoples.
Why
And
is that?
I don't know. It's partly, I think there are different traditions around the world. I mean, different places you go have different sort of like curriculum priorities, and we've always tended to have this very sort of great events, great man sort of tradition. So you know, Magna Carta's there. You go and look at the great prime ministers, things like that. Whereas, so in some ways, it's a cultural thing, and it's, I think people get socialised into ways of thinking, ways of doing. And I think coming back to the thing, one of the things you mentioned, I've been talking about, is this idea of critical curriculum thinkers, and actually stepping back and thinking, actually, I need to think about the how, what, and the why of the curriculum. What is it I'm teaching? And why am I teaching that? Teachers, in my experience, are very good at the how, but I think that there's less thought put into the what and the why. And I think in some ways, the introduction of the national curriculum in 1990 made that harder, because in a sense teachers were given something to work from. And I think the other work I've done is I've been quite surprised about how socialized teachers are into teaching particular things. So I mean, I've mainly looked at secondary school history curriculum, and lots of schools I've been to, virtually everything you teach from 1066 up to the end of the 17th century is virtually identical. And given the national curriculum isn't that restrictive in many ways, I mean, it outlines broad topics, but beyond that, it gives very, very, very little directed guidance as to what should be taught. Teachers do have a huge amount of flexibility, and I think it's a case of encouraging teachers to think about that, recognize that, and to take advantage of that. But I think, coming back to your point about the call for Black British history, I think in some ways that reflects a more broader concern about the existence of white privilege, and actually the need for that to be recognized and understand how that dominates the way people think and the way people do things. And I think needing to deconstruct that is important, because I say some of the work I've done previously with trainee history teachers, and particularly white trainee history teachers, trying to get them to understand teaching about a broader range of topics, was quite illuminating, and sort of like the difficulty they had in understanding why they ought to do that. And actually, if you're teaching British Empire, what perspective should you teach it from, and why? And so if you're bringing in these broader topics, what are you trying to achieve through the process of doing that?
No, what you're saying about the sharing of different perspectives and the bottom-up approach and the teaching of people's history rather than an elite form of history is reflected in some of the comments that I've got from the audience. So I'm going to read out a couple of names. Anne-Marie Hudson says, do you agree that as long as we are confined to a discourse about British history, we will fail to educate global citizens? Is this what you're suggesting, Richard?
I think one of the interesting things is lots of countries present national histories and things, and actually one of the things we need to recognise, and we want the young people we work with to recognise it, is that nations are a social construct. They haven't always existed, and actually, if you go back to the Angevin Empire, for example, where was Britain? In some ways, I think British history. I've always said that British history in some ways is easy to define, because you can sort of like get to the edge of the country and you forget your feet wet, and therefore it stops. Whereas actually you look at some European countries, things blur a bit more as countries shift. But I think there is actually a lack of recognition that, you know, Britain has spilled out beyond these shores all over time at various points in different ways, and actually having that sense of understanding helps you to problematize this idea of Britishness. And I think it's a really good question to ask people: what is British history? And actually, how do you define that, and where do you draw the boundaries and things? And actually, I think it's very easy to see that it's very permeable, and actually you can spread out from this sort of like the sense of these islands, and actually that there's something a bit broader there. I mean, I think it's important that we talk about history, because that's what we're in the business of, really. British history puts a certain bracket around it in people's minds, but actually if you contest that and problematize what do we mean by Britain, then you suddenly start to see it is more permeable, and you can use, I think you can use that as an opportunity to discuss those issues and to actually explore things beyond these shores.
Okay, brilliant. Let's go back to if we can go back to slide 16, Dwight, and look at some of the responses that we had about decolonising and diversification and other, and what we find here is overwhelmingly the best approach that that people are kind of discussing is through decolonising, but diversification comes way beyond that. But I'm just looking at some of the responses that we've got from the audience on that as well. Is there, does one come before the other, or you know, does what comes first? Is it the chicken or the egg, or I mean, is it diversification in order to allow for decolonisation, or we need to decolonise in order to diversify?
I think in some way diversifying is in some ways easier and more comfortable for people to address the issue first. And so in some ways it is potentially a way in. I think the problem is if you think, okay, I've diversified my curriculum, that's the end of the story, then that's where it's going to become problematic. Because I think ideally, because it's linked to notions of white privilege, I think the difficulty really is it's actually the onus is on the teacher to understand themselves and their own white privilege. I mean, in some ways, diversification is a knowledge thing. You know, it's just a sort of like substantive knowledge thing. Actually, do I know enough about Benin to teach it? Do I know enough about the role of Indian troops in World War I to teach that? So that's a barrier. But actually, I think the issue around decolonising is actually people recognising their own position, where they come from. I mean, some of the work I did early on, I did an action research project on the work I was doing with my trainee teachers, and I adopted critical race theory as part of the framework I was using, and I was actually quite shocked at how white my course was. And I then had to sort of like go through that process of deconstructing and understanding myself, my experiences and things, in order to come to a realization about what the problem was and where the problem had come from, in order to free myself from that. And I think that's actually quite a hard process, and I think that's why that's one of the major challenges for people involved in teacher training, trying to get the majority, you know, who will be white trainee teachers to understand this process.
Yeah, that's a point. That's a point that's come up in the chat as well about it's gone now. Yeah, it was saying that it's about you know, who's teaching history at universities and what content they're using, and it, you know, that relates to, I guess, what you were just saying about being able to step back and understand your own reflexive self and biases you hold. Is this where you're going?
Yeah, I think so, but I think it's a deeper root it's a deeper rooted problem than just what's going on at universities. I mean, if you look at the evidence, the number of students from minority ethnic backgrounds just decreases as you go through the curriculum. So actually, the numbers we got for GCSE for minority ethnic backgrounds is not as high a proportion as in terms of the white counterparts. And you go to A level, it drops down. You go to university, it drops down. So there is an element there. I think partly my feelings is partly the lack of history teacher role models, but in a sense, that's not an excuse. I mean, the issue then is actually the vast majority of the history teaching population is going to be white, and therefore there is responsibility on those teachers to take these ideas on board and to grapple with them, to create a sort of different curriculum. So there's that element. There is an issue over content, I feel, in the Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 and A-level curricula. I know, for example, very, very few schools do OCR's A-level West African kingdoms, for example. Sure. It's there, it's a fantastic opportunity, but not many people have taken that on. And then I know at university level, there are quite big debates in departments about the nature of the courses they teach and trying to make those much more representative and inclusive. I know Hakim Adi at Chichester University is sort of like a great advocate of this, but actually the number of black PhD students is frighteningly small from our understanding of the situation. So there is an issue in terms of actually who's teaching and what people are being taught and this, that, and the other. But in some ways, that puts more of the emphasis, I feel, on those who are doing the teaching, majority who will be white, to actually engage with this and look at ways to address it.
Yeah. Okay. Can we look at the slide 26, Dior, where we asked, because it will almost build upon what we were talking about in terms of challenges for the dominant workforce, in primary school education, secondary school education. 88% of teachers are white and British, and this is what this is what our audience said, that it's the reflexive ability to dismantle their own constructed selves that is the challenge for decolonising the curriculum. And you've just kind of pointed to your own experiences of that. How do we build in more opportunities for teachers to be reflexive in that?
There is, I mean, if you look at teacher training and teaching generally, there is a great emphasis on reflective practice. That I don't think that's the issue. I mean, I think part of the issue is actually what people are encouraged to reflect on, and this is where I've sort of come back to this idea of critical curriculum thinkers, because it's teachers tend to reflect on pedagogy and how they're teaching, by and large, and so that's what they tend to get better at. But there is less reflection on the purposes of what they're doing, what they're teaching, why they're teaching it, what they're trying to achieve by teaching it. So I think there's an element of that which needs to be built in, and I think that a number of things you've offered there, I mean, they are connected. So I think in order to be able to dismantle your constructed self, you need to have something which sort of like prompts you to do that. And it may be an awareness that your own subject knowledge on the topic is not strong enough, and therefore working on that gives you a new way of seeing, which then starts you to question why you've taught the way you've taught it in the past. And so I think those sort of things are sort of like very tightly bound up. But it's also, in a sense, being able to step outside of your own experiences. So the idea of understanding who you're teaching and where they've come from, and they've got different life experience to your life experience, and they may be coming from a perspective where the community history is very different to the history you're teaching. But again, that's why I'd then question the fact actually the sort of history we tend to teach tends to be very political, elitist, top-down sort of history, and actually there's a more interesting way to teach things from a bottom-up perspective. I know I did some work in my area, some local secondary schools, and I was looking at the connection their minority ethnic students had with the curriculum, and there was little connection to it by and large, and there's actually quite a lot of hostility to it. And so one of the things they introduced was much stronger element of personal histories. And so I actually started, they sort of like took the idea of who do you think you are, that sort of like the TV program, and allowed students to do that, to then bring in different voices and different perspectives and things like that. So that was quite helpful. But I think the other interesting thing which came out of that study is that even the white students had a strong disconnect to the history they're being taught, because it was a very political, elitist sort of history, and it had very little connection and resonance to their everyday lives and who they were. And so I think there's lots of things we need to rethink, and I think sometimes it's just a question of asking the right questions. And so asking the question, the reasons for teaching history are complex and diverse, and I think often as the adults in the room we may have those discussions with each other, but I don't think we properly have those discussions with the students.
Can I ask you a question around, because I've got a response here from Richard Grace, and he says that diversity training for all teachers, lecturers at all levels through a wider CPD package, which goes beyond a computer training program with no feedback. So diversity training for all teachers, what do you see? I mean, what would you see in that diversity training? Within that diversity training, would that involve an opportunity to be reflexive? Would it involve anti-racist training, or that for me, that is what would need to occur, that that teachers would need to be able to be reflexive and reflective and to learn about anti-racism. In fact, they could use the events that have occurred this summer with the pulling down of the statues to we know that isn't, that they're not history, but they could use those particular moments to debate their positions on history. But what do you think should be involved in diversity training?
I think those things are important. I think I'm sort of like coming from much more of a secondary perspective, but I know secondary teachers tend to look at things through the lens of their subjects, and so I think there needs to be questions about the subject and why they do what they do, where's it come from, those sorts of things, what the alternatives are, what different ways of seeing there are. So I think that's important. I also think there needs to be some hard questions asked about why is it so few students from minority backgrounds do particular subjects? Why is it that those students tend to get lower grades than other students, that sort of thing? And I've often felt that some of the work I've done previously, there has to be a recognition that if racism is not at a personal level, it's got to be at an institutional level. And I think there needs to be some discussion around what forms of institutional racism exist within the education system, because I think what tends to happen is if you don't recognise that, then any racism has got to exist at an individual level, and most people, as you know, will turn and say, "Well, I'm not racist," and so therefore you don't get anywhere with that. So you have to ask the questions about actually what are the problems within the system, and how do we address those at an individual and at a systemic level? I mean, Dave Gilbourne's work on that use of critical race theory in education, I think should be much more widely known. And we need to discuss those questions collectively, so we can come up with a collective answer for them.
You're right. I'm with you. I think what my concern about that, especially if you're going to be bringing up stories of oppression and violence against minority ethnic group people, epistemic violence, symbolic violence, psychological violence, is the issue of guilt. and denial. And if the spotlight is on you or your particular ethnic group as being guilty, then you might not want to engage in that reflective process. Okay.
That's why I think it's more important that it's recognised that these issues are a systemic issue, because otherwise they then become individualised. And I think if it's then seen as individual responsibility, no, it's your fault, then people are much more likely to become defensive about it. Whereas if there is a recognition that there is white privilege, there is a recognition that then feeds into sort of like systemic ways of doing things, then that's something you can, in a sense, look at how you can tackle it more readily. So I think that's why that's an important distinction to make.
And teachers need to be prepared and willing to want to transform as well, because the people of different positions, they might think that the status quo is perfectly fine. Why should we change? That needs to be considered. Can we just on a bit to because I want to bring up slide 33. Could you bring that up for us? Slide 33. Yes. And so I asked some questions in relation to the question about cross-cultural encounters, which was kind of related to the research that we've done, and what sorts of stories that we don't find in the national curriculum could potentially be applied in teaching and learning, centering the minority ethnic group narrative to teach and learn about those fundamental British values which have been imposed, haven't been defined, but they've been imposed. So what if we've got Stephen Lawrence dead in the centre there? What are your thoughts on those responses, Richard? You're using cross-cultural encounters to teach about fundamental British values. Do you think that's something that could be done via history, or?
I think so. I mean, I think one of the things which sometimes worries me, and I think we might be able to, I don't know if we'll be able to explore this, but when I was doing some of my early research, the thing which concerned me was actually a lot of the examples which people gave as sort of like Black British history or sort of like things like this tended to be also come under the definition of controversial or difficult things to teach, and it makes me uneasy that these things are seen as difficult or challenging issues. And in some ways, I'd argue that history should be troubling. It should make you ask decent questions.
It should be troubling. It should actually.
Yeah. But I think at the same time, we also ought to be looking at examples of cooperation and whether there are more positive stories which can come through. So that's interesting. I know over the summer, Toby Green, a historian on West African history, did a whole series of podcasts and things. But interesting, he's also been an author of a secondary school textbook used by West African children for their exams. And reading that gives you a very different perspective on West African history than you would from a white perspective. And there's a lot more sense of cooperation between the early white settlers and explorers down in West Africa and the communities they encountered, and there's sort of like there's mutual trade and exchanges and ambassadors and this, that, and the other. And what we sometimes focus on is too much of the difficulties. Was actually where we want to talk about is actually how people also got on. And I think that needs to be both those perspectives here. So I can see that in some of these, which could. I
mean, I think I spoke about someone wrote the Notting Hill Carnival, and so we can talk about the troubling essence of that in the 1950s. Those cross-cultural encounters. Now we're in 2020. When it comes to going to that particular area of London every August, there's a celebration. There's a multicultural celebration. So there's and there's cooperation in that. So that kind of blends both, I guess.
Yeah, so I think it's well, because it's also, you talk about African soldiers and Haitians as well. You know, that's absolutely correct. That you know, one of the things I often talk to my history trainees about, you know, is when's the first black recorded presence in the UK, and you're often surprised that it is at the Roman time. But if you go to the Roman Empire, I mean, these people were citizens of the Roman Empire.
Sure.
You know, and so they weren't necessarily defined by their skin color or anything. But
exactly.
So
yeah. And this is why we mentioned people like Septimus Severus earlier on. Why do you think then that you know, here are some examples given by the audience: Stephen Lawrence, the Notting Hill Carnival, the Bristol bus boycott. Why aren't they part of the national curriculum now? I mean, we tend to look at American history to speak about issues of race. For example, if we, you know, there's Rosa Parks, there's Martin Luther King. Why isn't Stephen Lawrence part of the national curriculum so we can learn about you know, about cross-cultural encounters? You know, why isn't the Notting Hill Carnival part of the national curriculum so we can learn about troubling?
Yeah. I think it's partly the process of curriculum making is complicated, and in some ways it's not always transparent. I think one of the things, and this may be part of the master narrative, is actually, you know, about Britain as a fairly tolerant society and this, that, and the other, and so therefore we look at other places like America saying, oh, dreadful, wasn't it dreadful there? They had to have, you know, sort of like the Montgomery bus boycotts, nor wasn't that, you know, the segregation there dreadful, sort of thing. And it's easier to be critical from a distance and to say, actually, let's talk about, you know, tolerance and this, that, and the other, and actually how we develop these things, and that society wasn't great, was it? Without necessarily throwing a light onto us. And I think it's, in some ways, it's that, you could almost argue it's that sort of old-fashioned Whig view of history, that, you know, Britain was the centre of liberty, you know, parliamentary, you know, cradle of democracy, and all this, that, and the other, and that has become fairly ensconced in this master narrative, and these sorts of things tend to trouble that a bit too much, and that's why I think, you know, in some ways we do want history to trouble us. We do want it to ask us awkward questions, but we also want it to be a more fully rounded picture. As actually, there are difficulties, but it doesn't mean that we've always had difficulties with others. You know, actually, that there are ways which groups have got on and sought to you know, live side by side quite happily. So I think that's my reading of why we have the curriculum we have. But it is, and I know particularly that the last version, last curriculum did have quite a heavy steering hand from certain ministers in terms of how it should be presented and constructed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes now. I think it would be really good to sort of summarize. We haven't been able to cover all of the points. I was going to talk a bit more about historical consciousness. I think I did anyway, in terms of how I saw the training teachers in my study shift their orientations, and hopefully the audience can take that particular theory away and consider that in terms of curriculum deconstruction and current curriculum. Just want to sort of summarize what we've spoken about. Thank you, Richard. Slide 39, Dior, if possible. Are you there? Are we able to slide 39 up? About the action? Maybe not. I mean, I think some summary points from this discussion and from the presentation are these. You know, we need to come to accept that history is not a static collection of facts. This is what we've articulated at the beginning and through the discussion with Richard. It's a process of discovery. It's happening today as we speak. It's happened this summer. This is why, I guess, you know, one of the triggers for this particular webinar. And there's there's reflection and there's reinterpretation by each generation on what is of most value to them. Taking action to decolonize the curriculum so as to become aware of white privilege and to understand how mindsets have created those institutional structures. They give greater favour to the white majority. That's the point that Richard was making about sort of placing more emphasis upon the structures rather than the individual. Structural changes required. Decolonise the curriculum teaching and learning. This will provide a fuller and richer historical understanding of the past. And let's prioritise teaching and learning through cross-cultural encounters, through the history of peoples on the British Isles over the ages, because that can help to advance learning about fundamental British values, or notions of those anyway, through history that represents a range of people's experiences, people's individual experience, or even group experiences. And including Black history within the curriculum is not a rewriting of history. It's recognising that there's been a conspicuous absence of certain forms of historical experiences taught in the curriculum, a very Anglo-centric curriculum. And it's therefore giving trainee teachers, current teachers, educators, it's empowering them to reposition the given curriculum, and that will obviously allow, well, obviously, but it should allow for students as recipients to generate broader and deeper knowledge bases in their learning. Those are the summary points that I want to leave as part of this webinar. Next slide. Where's she gone? Next slide. Thank you for coming along. There are our contact details, Dr. Marlon Moncrief, Professor Richard Harris. Thank you, Richard, for your time this afternoon. It's always fantastic to speak with you and to learn from you.
It's been a pleasure, thank you.
Yep. And just the final slide. Thank you, everybody. Next slide, for participating in this BERA event today. And I hope you have a good weekend. Thank you very much. Goodbye.